Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Co-op. You know, in business, there are two main ingredients. There's a lot of ingredients that you need to have a successful business, but the two main ones are capital and labor. Labor and capital. And too often those two main ingredients are at odds. There's a conflict. In a capitalistic society, the folks that have the capital, that owns the capital, the shareholders, normally will rent out their labor. They try to own the labor, and they try to pay the labor as little as possible. And in a worker co-op, in a cooperative world, we have that the laborers own the business. They own their own labor, and then they rent capital. And today we have Cliff Rosenthal, who has spent his life on the capital side trying to get the laborers to be able to rent capital, get the laborers, the low-income communities, to get capital at a price that they can afford so that they can own their own labor. Good morning, Cliff. How are you doing, sir?
Good morning, Vernon. Glad to be with you today.
Thank you for taking that time out to be with us and share your story. When I read about you, this is what I see you have done. Would you agree with how I opened this up?
Well, yes. Access to capital in the hands of community is absolutely fundamental. And it doesn't flow naturally. We've had to struggle for it to get it. Of course, what I found in credit unions was a way that communities could begin to control capital for their own needs without maximizing profit at the expense of labor.
Yeah, that's a struggle all between labor and capital. And too often, when I got my MBA, every decision was made on what's the greatest return on investment. What's the greatest return on the capital? What gives the person that has the capital the most money? Often it did not make a difference about how it affected labor. Matter of fact, you would move the plant to wherever you get the lowest labor cost, or how it affected the environment. It just, what was the return on investment? So you said this access to capital didn't flow natural, but you mentioned credit union. So what is a credit union?
Well, basically, a credit union is a financial cooperative. It's a group of people with a common bond, a connection among each other, who decide to get together, and in this country, at least, to get a charter, either a federal charter or a state charter, to get insurance with that, and they pool their savings to loan to each other, basically to satisfy the needs that they desire, that they define for themselves, for their communities.
So they pool their monies to loan to each other. They're taking their own pennies, nickels, dimes, dollars now, put those together and deposits into this institution that they own.
Correct.
And then they end up deciding what they will loan on, what kind of products they'll loan, and what interest they'll get back.
Sure.
Okay. So how did you get involved in credit unions?
Well, my story really begins with a different form of co-op, namely food cooperatives. In the late 1960s, early 70s, I lived in Washington Heights, New York City, a neighborhood that's now famous for the show about that name. And there was another crisis that we were confronting in that time, and it was world hunger. And I began to learn about how basically the large corporations control the food supply and resulted in higher prices. So I learned about food co-ops, and in my spare time while I was a graduate student, I began to organize a neighborhood food co-op. And after I moved from New York, I organized a couple more as well. So really, this was my driving passion throughout the 1970s. I supported myself for part of that time by translating a Russian encyclopedia as a freelancer. Then I actually got job organizing food co-ops. And finally, I was working for a migrant and seasonal farm worker organization in the late 1970s. And my boss said, we really need a credit union to serve our communities, our farm worker organizations and their communities. And like most of Americans, I didn't know what a credit union was.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second before
Sure.
you go. I got it. But you're in, where were you working with the farmers? You said you were working with
Farm workers. It was a national advocacy organization for migrant and seasonal farm workers based in Washington.
So you're based in Washington, D.C., working with farm. But I saw somewhere where you developed food co-ops for migrant farm workers and Native Americans.
Yeah. Before that, my first quote real job was working for American Indians for Development in Connecticut, organizing a food co-op for their constituents. These were mostly urban folks, so there were a couple of reservations in Connecticut. But that was really the first time that I organized co-ops for, and anyone was paying me to do it. Before that, I'd simply done it as a volunteer. Okay. So then I took my expertise to Washington and worked for that farm worker organization.
So you're in D.C. now in the 70s. You're working for this farmer group, and your boss says, we want a credit union.
Yeah. There are these things called credit unions, and we think that we can organize one and better serve our constituents, our organizations, and the farm workers they serve. So I learned all about credit unions, and Vernon, honestly, I simply fell in love with this concept of a credit union as a co-op. It's a money co-op. Pure and simple, it's a money co-op, financial cooperative.
So have you heard of SUSUs?
I sure have. So, yeah, SUSUs are one of the many informal ways that people have to loan to each other. I've heard it mostly in connection with immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean here in Brooklyn. So it's very popular here in Brooklyn.
So I had a guest on last week, or I think it was just last week, where he said that I asked him when was the first time he was in a SUSU, or he was from Trinidad. He said elementary school. They were saving. They had SUSUs in elementary school. They started saving. And the SUSUs is what he said he got his money for to buy his plane ticket to come to the U.S. to go to college. So, yeah, they're very informal, but he said he had more trust in the SUSU, people pooling their money, just like with a credit union. Okay, so the credit union seems like it's a natural fallout of a SUSU. A next step to make a SUSU formal would be to form a credit union or join a credit union.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of people, again, my view is shaped largely from living in Brooklyn, which has some of the largest immigrant communities anywhere, both from the Caribbean and in Africa. And people who have experience with SUSUs, do sometimes look to start credit unions.
Okay, so you're in the 70s now, and in the farm workers, your boss says to you, we want to start a credit union, and our farm workers and all of these organizations would benefit from it. So where did you go to find out about them?
There was a gentleman in Washington by the name of Floyd Augustinelli who worked for an organization that did work with credit unions at that time. So we had to educate ourselves. He told us about credit unions and the basic structure of them and how you had to deal with regulators and how you had to set your policies and so forth. So it was a real and quite exciting education for me, how these credit unions worked.
I like it when you said you fell in love with this, because I was here in D.C. working with limited equity housing co-ops and fell in love with them because of the way that the people, everyday people, made decisions. They learned how to make really informed decisions and running a business. And you fell in love with this credit union of how you can get money to the low-income communities, farm workers, or whomever else.
Correct.
Yeah. So where did you go from there?
Well, then I ended my weekend commuting route back and forth. My wife-to-be was living in Brooklyn. I was living in Washington, and we decided that we couldn't pay those airfares anymore. So I moved back to Brooklyn, and as it turned out, we lived, I will say, by the way, that my wife lived in a communal house. So I was joining a communal house, a little urban commune. And about a mile from our house, it turned out there was a national organization of these credit unions, of community development credit unions. And I thought this would be the absolute perfect way to marry what was, my interest, my dominant interests with my living situation. And I hung around for about 6 months. I volunteered, and finally they offered me a job, and that was it. And for 32 years, I worked for the National Federation of Community Development Credit Unions, which is now known as Inclusive, which captures what we were about.
National Federation of Community Development Credit Unions. That's a mouthful. Okay.
It was.
And now it's Inclusive without an E.
Correct. That's their branding.
Okay. So you love your wife-to-be who was in Brooklyn, so you moved back to Brooklyn. You lived in a communal housing situation. She did. So a communal housing is that everybody in that commune owns the house? And you have policies of how it runs, or did you rent a house?
Yeah. Basically, people contributed a certain amount for expenses. So we shared all expenses. We shared childcare. We shared chores. We shared maintenance for the house. You, as a housing co-op person, understand this was very small scale. This was, what had been a 2-family house that 3 families were living in, and so forth. But it's basically a pretty similar principles.
Fantastic. As a senior person now, I would not mind finding a communal house to live in, both for, particularly with COVID, just being able to talk to people, and then sharing the load. Okay, so your wife is in Brooklyn, you move back, and you are a block or so away from Community Development Credit Unions, the National Federation of volunteer there, and then you got a job, and you were there for 30-some years.
32 years, yeah.
And what were you?
I thought it was going to be a smooth sailing, but the organization at first was federally funded, and then under the Reagan administration, we lost all of our funding. Everybody left. So I basically took it on without salary for a while till we could start rebuilding.
Wow. And so you were there by yourself?
I was very fortunate that I got a fellowship, a mid-career fellowship, and Vernon, I was not trained in business like you. My training was as a Russian historian, but here I became involved in cooperatives and credit unions, and I realized I needed to know something about finance. So I was very fortunate to get a fellowship that, taught me a little bit about financial institutions. And I was especially fortunate that I was able to hire a woman to be my associate. Her name was Annie Vamper. She was an African-American woman from the Southeast who had managed credit unions and who had worked for the regulatory agency. And, she came to work with me. And for much of the 1980s, it was the two of us. It was the Cliff and Annie, the Annie and Cliff show.
Okay.
Sometimes they call us the odd couple.
Okay. The Annie and Cliff show. Annie being African-American, and you are, I assume, a Russian?
Well, white male ancestors of whom were basically driven out of the area controlled by Russia because they were Jewish.
All right. We have to take our first break, and we have the Annie and Cliff show. A white male Jewish run out of Russia and Annie out of the Southeast who had worked for credit unions, run credit unions, and had worked for the regulators, so she knew all about that. And you had to go back and learn about business and finance.
That's right.
Because you are a historian. That's a wonderful, wonderful background to merge together to figure out what to do. Listen, everybody, we'll be right back to Cliff to look at the rest of his life and how he helped to get capital for these co-ops. We'll be right back.
Your news talk station.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Cooperative, and we have Mr. Cliff Rosenthal on with us this morning. And Cliff has spent his life working in the cooperative world, helping communities get capital. And what we were talking about right before the break was that Cliff was federally funded community development credit unions, and they lost their funding under the Reagan administration. He took away a lot of money for a lot of different programs.
He sure did.
And so you're by yourself, got some money, and hired Annie, who came in to help, and you went out and got some knowledge about this. So it's just the two of you, and with your background being Jewish and kicked out of Russia, I guess you had a heart for helping people that were down and out. You'd experienced that.
Yes, and I didn't experience discrimination directly and so forth, but, somehow I think that you're right. And this was my ancestors, really my grandparents and my parents to some degree. We had a sense that we were outside of the mainstream, and that we had to really struggle to be part of America.
So throughout the civil rights world in the 60s and the 70s, Jewish people, rabbis, really coalesced with Martin Luther King and even today because of that same sense of that history, which I think is really good. I'm sorry for the history that people are discriminated against, either because of their religion or because of the color of their skin or whatever reason in terms of women because of their gender. So the discrimination, whatever it is, if we could get all people together that have been discriminated against in this world, we could really create a country for the people.
Yes.
Okay. So where did you go from there? You're in Brooklyn with Annie. I know you stayed in Brooklyn. Did you stay in the commune, or did you buy a brownstone or something? Where did you go with family?
Well, the communal house lasted for a number of years, and then it sort of decommunalized, but became a 2-unit housing cooperative. And I stayed here, and I've lived here ever since.
Okay.
In Brooklyn. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Have any children?
I have a daughter with my wife and a stepson who's out in California.
Okay. Grandchildren?
Just one. Just my little 3-year-old, who, as you and I speak, is downstairs with my wife.
Okay.
And we're very fortunate at this time of COVID that we were able to see her.
That is fantastic. A big smile on your face when you talk about that. Big smile.
She taught me how to smile even in these difficult times.
Yeah, you're very fortunate to be able to see them and be that close to her. So you've written a book. Okay, it's called Democratizing Finance, Origins of the Community Development Financial Institutions. What's a community development financial institution?
Well, through the 1980s, you had credit unions, you had banks and so forth, and they didn't really have any special name. Ours were community development credit unions. That had always been our name. There was a community development bank, South Shore Bank, and so forth. But basically, in the late 1980s, we came off of an era that redlining still existed, that people of color and communities of color were still being denied access to credit and banking services. So I and other folks that we worked with were trying to find alternatives. We know we couldn't take over the whole banking system. We weren't that ambitious. But we tried to organize alternatives, both credit unions and low-income communities, and these other entities called community development loan funds, which were nonprofit lenders as well. We formed a coalition together, and what we realized is in terms of accessing capital, we needed a lot more money than we could put together just by we pooled money in our communities. So I particularly put forth this platform of trying to get federal investment in these institutions, which we began calling community development financial institutions. They were credit unions, they were loan funds, they were venture funds, they were micro lenders, and so forth. And lo and behold, Bill Clinton, who was aware of Community Development Bank, South Shore Community Development Bank, became enamored with this idea and campaigned for a platform of creating a fund to provide capital to 100 community development banks and 1,000 microenterprise loan programs. So basically, we joined our ideas with him. Legislation was passed in 1994, and a fund was created that has made a huge difference in providing capital to these communities.
So if you just take a look at Reagan versus Clinton, okay, in terms of what government can do to help people,
Yeah.
or hurt people, in terms of Reagan taking money out of social programs, out of banking for communities, and then Bill Clinton coming in, putting money in. So before the 1990s, there was no community development finance institutions. But then you all put these together. You got federal money to help with the pooled money that the communities brought together.
That's right. To leverage that money.
So there was a guy named Papa Sin who was on the show. He's from Senegal, and he helped to create co-ops there. And he said that you anticipate getting money from, when you pay taxes, you're anticipating what you can get government to help fund. I never thought about taxes that way. It was always a pain to me. But when we put money into the government, then we can look to the government to help us to fund those things that we need done. In this case was, how can we get cash? How can we get capital? And that's the federal money. But we put that money in as society, and then we can help regulate where that money goes, which helps the community. I'm glad Bill liked that. I'm glad you all pushed that, worked with that, got it politically accepted. So tell me what happened then, because you're still working with what is now called inclusive. So are you still developing co-ops around the U.S.?
Yes. So we helped organize new credit unions, one which I sometimes describe as my second born because it's closest to my heart. In 1984, this group of community activists on New York City's Lower East Side came to us to help start a credit union. So Annie and I worked with them to organize that. It was started on May Day, 1986, on the Lower East Side, in a building that had been turned over to them by a big bank in recognition of their Community Reinvestment Act responsibilities. And I can't take credit for it, except to my early role. This credit union has grown from literally nothing to today being an $80 million in asset institution serving low-income New York.
What's the name of it?
In the 80s, Annie and I organized credit unions. I made the case for it. I raised money for it. Annie told them actually how you ran these businesses, what the operations were, what the regulations were, and so forth. And we worked in New York. We worked in Chicago. We worked in South Central Los Angeles, where we worked to start a credit union on the eve of the riots of 1992. And we could not get that credit union started because the regulators were being a little obstructive until the riots after the acquittal of the officers who attacked Rodney King. That brought back to the government the urgency of providing people in South Central the means to serve their communities.
So what was the name of the credit union in the Lower East Side?
Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union. People
first.
Absolutely.
Planet second, profit third. That's what the credit union's all about. People first, the planet second, the environment, and then profit. You have to have profit now. If you're running a business, you've got to have surplus. It. But
we may call it surplus, but it's profit, yes.
Yeah, surplus or profit. And unfortunately, in a capitalistic society, in a capitalistic business, is 3 Ps also. It's profit first, profit second, and profit third. Okay, that's the main run. So you were in South Central Chicago and in New York. And it's unfortunate about Rodney King, just like with George Floyd, it sort of wakens us up.
Yes, that was a wake-up call. Yeah. I know, and it's a sad thing that crises like this are required sometimes to focus the attention of the people with power in this country on the needs of the communities that we serve.
Well, not only people of power, but in both cases, the world blew up. I mean, in George Floyd, there was people protesting all over the world.
Yes.
Okay, and all over the U.S., people protesting. So it just wakes up people to wake up those people of power, those people in politics, yes. And everybody get to see those awful, awful things. Okay, you're creating co-ops in California in the West, in New York, in the Northeast, and in the Midwest, in Chicago. You are helping people to pool their limited resources to come together with federal funds to get more and more capital in communities to solve community problems. That's the other thing that Papa Sin said, co-ops solve community problems. And that's your second love after your wife. Maybe third after your wife and your daughter. But I got it. Listen, everybody, we'll be right back, and we'll talk more about what Cliff has done to help create co-ops and these funds for the communities.
Your news talk station.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Co-op. And, you know, National Cooperative Bank has sponsored us for the last 8+ years we've been on the air. And National Co-op Bank, who was created to help fund these organizations, credit unions, and support their members through providing financial products, innovative financial products. And they've done a great job, and they've been a wonderful partner. Cliff, in your book, Democratizing Finance, Origins of Community Development Financial Institutions Movement, you start off with Benjamin Franklin, go all the way through to Freeman's Bank and all the way to today. Why did you start with Benjamin Franklin? I know you're a historian. That's your backdrop.
Yeah, there are not many sort of basic themes about finance that most people will know. Probably it's as basic as a penny saved is a penny earned and so forth. Somehow I found that that he was interested in lending. I read a little bit of the biography of Franklin and found out that he basically what would be described almost as a microfund today. He's sort of the grandfather of it. You know, he'd loaned, first of all, he came out of poverty, and he recognizes the difficulty of getting capital if you start with nothing. So he left a substantial amount of money, particularly in Philadelphia and Boston, to establish these funds. And I thought, wow, this seems very similar to what people have been doing today. It had a lot of elements of credit unions in it because there was sort of peer pressure. You'd have co-signers and so forth. And he's increasingly being recognized as this, obviously this genius with hands in many fields, but also in finance as well. I mean, had to start somewhere, Vernon, and the fact that the need for finance, the need to access capital is so fundamental that in every age and in every group, people will be searching for alternatives because the commercial banking system, as you well know, was never designed to serve people without very much money. It's not what the business model is about, and it hasn't served them.
So the banks are interested in three things also. They're interested in getting their money back. 1, 2 is getting their money
Fair
back.
enough.
And 3 is getting their money back. So they end up loaning money to people who already have assets, that already have cash or land or a business. And then if you go to in the U.S., a black family has 10% of the wealth of a white family. So this was before COVID. It may be worse than that now. Yeah. So don't have assets in the black communities and in brown communities, native communities, so banks wouldn't loan to us. Okay, it's really just that simple. So we needed other alternatives. So we had to pool our money, whether it's SUSUs or credit unions. We had to pool our money to take care of, whether it's borrowing people with mutual aid societies. Yeah, we had to do that ourselves. And I like co-ops. The first principle, the first value is self-help. Self-help by working with others, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this Freeman? What was the Freeman's Bank all about?
Well, toward the end of the Civil War, as it became clear that the North was going to finally win, you had many black soldiers who were fighting, and they were to earn money, but no place to put it. So some philanthropists and abolitionists got together and went to Congress to establish an institution in which black former soldiers could place their money. And it actually grew phenomenally well. It was not, and this was crucial, it was not backed by what we call the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. It was confusing. It was chartered by Congress, but the money was not guaranteed. Went along great for a few years, but then the trustees of the bank, who were primarily well-to-do white men, began to use the bank for purposes such as speculation and real estate deals. That was compounded by an economic crisis in 1873. So the bank was in dire straits, and they reached out to Frederick Douglass to come in and try to save it. And sadly, by that time, as Frederick Douglass in his one of his autobiographies put it, I was married to a corpse. There was no money left, and the bank was on its way to dissolution.
And so people, those soldiers, those blacks, they lost their money because it wasn't guaranteed by the U.S. or?
It was not guaranteed. Some were able to reclaim the money, and some, very sadly, were not able to demonstrate their ownership, and they literally petitioned Congress for decades into the 20th century to get those modest savings back, and not all of them were able to do that. So it's ultimately, to me, a rather sad and tragic story of well-intentioned people and well-intentioned project that went astray.
Without the government either watching over it, evaluating it, and definitely not guaranteeing it. Maybe if they had guaranteed that money, they'd have watched over those investments a lot better. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's the major thing that would you say would cause a credit union to be successful?
Well, ultimately, you have to. It has to be capital, and it has to be a lending market. That's the other thing. You could gather $10 million, $20 million worth of deposits, but the way that a credit union makes money is loaning the money out within the community. They charge a little bit more than it costs them to bring in the deposits, and they live off the earnings from those loans and from investments. So that's the thing. You've got to have a group of people in a community or an association who have some common bond together. You have to identify folks who have a need for capital. Billionaires don't need a credit union; they have plenty of access to capital. But you need to be identifying a community or group of people who will borrow, who need to borrow, and who have the capacity to repay it. Those are the key elements. If you can do that, you can ultimately make it work. If as in a low-income community, you have access to an infusion of outside capital, you can accelerate the process enormously and reach self-sufficiency a lot faster. Otherwise, it can be a long struggle.
Okay. So a credit union is in the business of loaning money, just like banks are. That's what I hear you say. Okay.
Sure.
And that's why I couldn't always understand why they wouldn't loan the blacks if you're in the business of loaning money. But if you just struggle with, can they pay it back? And can I charge more money? How much money can I charge for this money? A credit union, what I found very interesting, what you said was they just try to charge money to help pay for their expenses. They don't have to gouge the customer to make usury fees or anything.
Right.
So you can get up interest rate lower than perhaps with the banks and other places in a credit union.
Yeah, you can. It's not for free. The credit union is not in the business of granting money or loaning money for free. It's got to meet its expenses. So that's the challenge of it, but it's also the power of it. If you develop your business and your business model such as it brings in enough income, you can be self-sufficient. You own your own financial institution. It pays for itself. You make decisions about your lending policies and so forth. And that's what I fell in love with, the notion of empowering people to make those sorts of financial decisions that affect their lives.
Wonderful.
Hope you're with me on that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. Empowering people to make decisions about their financial lives, empowering people to make decisions about where they live and how they live, and empowering people to have worker co-ops so that they can control their labor and their profits. Yeah, that's the love for co-ops. I got bitten by that bug. So inclusive. How many co-ops are in inclusive?
Inclusive now has more than 400 member credit unions. The credit union industry altogether has about 5,000 institutions. Both credit unions and banks, by the way, both of those industries have shrunk over the last 30 years. There used to be 10, 15, 20,000 banks, 10, 15, 20,000 credit unions. Now there are about 5,000 credit unions and 5,000 banks, And among those credit unions, more than 400 are members of Inclusive. And those are the credit unions that have a specific targeted mission of serving low to moderate income communities and communities that have been excluded from mainstream finance.
So what's some of the products that credit unions Inclusive have that helps the community?
Well, most any credit union, certainly within Inclusive, will provide loans for vehicles. And we're not just talking about new cars, which, as you know, have gotten quite expensive, but used cars that may not have a high value and would be very expensive to finance from a bank. So, they do unsecured loans. They do loans for used cars, for new cars. They also loan to small and minority businesses in their communities. And that became especially valuable during the COVID crisis. You may be familiar with the PPP program, which wasn't your PPPs, but the Payroll Protection Program. And credit unions and CDFI credit unions specifically played a major role in providing loans to those small entrepreneurs and neighborhood businesses that weren't being served by the banks even during the crisis. They also loan for housing purposes. And again, my second born, my favorite, the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, loans to self-help housing and to limited equity co-ops, as well as for shares too. So we're particularly proud of that.
So for anybody out there, a share loan is like a mortgage for a condo, a share loan for a cooperative. They very much look the same, but the share loan is for a share of stock, which is personal property, and the mortgage is for a deed. So they're very, very similar. They do the same kinds of things. So the sixth principle of cooperation is cooperation among co-ops. Do you find like these 400 plus inclusive, do they work together, or do these larger and smaller co-ops, do they work together?
Yeah, increasingly they are, and that's been especially true in the crisis. It's been thanks to the outreach that Inclusive has done, for sure. But what has been very gratifying, again, I've been in this field for 30 to 40 years, on that, the message and the mission that community development credit unions have always had in terms of serving excluded populations and low-income populations is more and more being adopted by some of the very big, substantial credit unions as well. And they're providing a lot of momentum, a lot of financial muscle in terms of working together. They've been helping in situations such as in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and so forth. And I do see, and I know that you've been a real advocate for the co-op principles. That cooperation among co-ops is very important, and it's expanding.
Fantastic. So you said that payroll protection program, they've come out and helped a lot. So as banks have been going down, you said there was 10 to 15,000 credit unions, 10 to 15,000 banks. Has that affected black banks and co-ops, credit unions that work for black?
Yeah. Distressingly so, that we have both among black-owned banks and primarily black credit unions, the numbers have decreased very substantially over the last 20 to 30 years. I think the number of black banks has declined from about 40 plus to about 20 in recent years.
Okay, so less than half of them. Okay, so we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the credit unions and your experience, but I really want to talk about the future. What do you see the future for that 3-year-old grandchild and with the role that co-ops can play coming out of COVID-19? We talked about racism, which is I find as a pandemic. We have the climate change, which I have as another pandemic. How can co-ops help, particularly credit unions? But we'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News talk station.
Information is power. That's why WOL ends up being a great partner. We're giving you information about co-ops, so you can either go start one, go find one, join one, so you can help improve your community. if there's a community problem, co-ops is a way of solving that problem. And right now we're talking about creating the capital to solve those community problems through co-ops and CDFIs. So what do you see the future for co-ops, or how can we come out of these pandemics better? And you can take either one of them: COVID, racism, climate change.
Oh, well, and then, as you know, the intersectionality of all those crises makes solving it more difficult. I think that there has been a real breakthrough in consciousness in several levels over the last couple of years. A painful one, resulting, from the crises like the murder of George Floyd and so forth. But there has been a kind of broad awakening to the issues that now we see in growing discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. It's become sort of the watchword in many parts of society. It's certainly been true among credit unions, which we've seen a much heightened engagement in those issues and a much heightened awareness of income inequality and the ways that even credit unions, even cooperatives, have not done what we might have done in terms of breaking down those barriers. So I think that, I've been very encouraged by, let's put it this way, let's follow the money. Mm-hmm. Congress has invested $12 billion in community development financial institutions and minority banks in the last year and a half. It goes so far beyond what I ever dreamed was possible in terms of accessing capital flows in the United States. So I think that it's going to lift many of the boats that we care about, both among our community development credit unions and among minority banks as well. I hope that it's going to be sustainable. I hope that it will continue and so forth. We see that institutions like our credit unions moving into areas like alternative energy. I was really privileged a few years ago to help charter something called the Clean Energy Credit Union, which provides financing for solar, for solar panels, for electric vehicles, and so forth. And this idea is spreading among credit unions also. So we're not the whole answer by any means, but, I think as relatively small financial institutions, credit unions have the flexibility and the agility to move to meet crises as they're emerging, which unfortunately they will continue.
Crises will continue, and I like this agility piece because it's owned by the community, the members in the community, people that make the deposits own the credit unions. They elect a board of directors. That board of directors controls the credit union.
Yeah.
They make the policies, decisions. They hire management. Management bring them different ideas of what to do, how to do it, how to make sure you meet your expenses, maybe have a little surplus, but therefore you can give great terms to the owners. That's who makes the loans. It's wonderful. How can people find out about this Clean Energy Credit Union? Is that in a particular state or?
Well, it's actually national. And I'd Google Clean Energy Federal Credit Union, and that should take you to the website.
Okay, go to Clean Energy Federal Credit Union. Google
Clean
it.
Energy. Yep.
Okay.
It's based in Colorado, but they've got members around the country.
So you had mentioned that 2012 was the year of cooperatives. The UN had declared a year of cooperatives. So you had pulled together some folks in 2011. What was that about?
Well, that was basically in anticipation of the UN year of cooperatives. So that October, I basically put the call out to try to get to every cooperative sector I knew in New York City to begin to work together. And we made some starts then. Unfortunately, I went off to Washington to work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, but the torch was picked up, and the Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City, we call it CENYC, CEANYC, was formed and continues to result in trying to build the bridges between the different cooperative sectors: credit unions, housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, and so forth, food cooperatives.
So I may have been at that meeting.
It would have been great.
Because at the UN, there was about 150 cooperators, and I was represented at National Association of Housing Co-ops. And we went from the meeting at the UN over to that, and I think that may be the same meeting, but I recall that there was a politician there, a lady, who got up and said that before she runs any election, she goes and find out what the co-ops are about. And I'm going, that would be nice if it happened all over the U.S., that if the politicians really knew about co-ops.
Yeah.
So,
well, I will tell you briefly that the newly elected Manhattan Borough president is a gentleman by the name of Mark Levine, who we worked with to start a credit union in Washington Heights that has really flourished. So, yeah, the message is getting out there.
Fantastic. I've had it that cooperators vote more than perhaps the general public because they understand voting, and they run for school boards or city council. Has that been your experience also?
Yeah, I've met some folks like that who've been state representatives and so forth, and city council members, for sure. I don't know how widespread it is, but it's very notable when it happens.
So how can people get your book?
Well, one easy way is to go to www.cliffrosenthal.com, and that'd be basically a portal to any of the online booksellers. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Freeman, which is my publisher, and Google. And that's an easy way to choose whichever one you like, or go to your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it.
Democratizing Finance. What does that mean?
That means getting access to credit and financial services through things like credit unions, nonprofit loan funds, even community development venture capital funds as well. These institutions were not widely known, or sometimes didn't exist before the last 30 years. They're growing, and they provide access to people who didn't have it before. And that's why I call it democratizing finance.
What do you see for the future, Cliff? I mean, we got to get out of this COVID, or maybe we just have to learn how to live with it. What do you see for the future?
Well, I see that we need to basically amplify the message a great deal. Something like 150 million people are members of credit unions, Vernon. And more people know that credit unions offer a good deal. But do they know about the cooperative essence of credit unions, and that there's a different way of organizing the finances of a society? We've still got some work to do. So what I hope is that this upsurge of interest in our kind of work will be accompanied by education as well about the cooperative nature of what we're about.
So that's the fifth principle of cooperation, which was my first love, and that's education, training, and information. My second love was the first principle. It's open to everybody, regardless of race or religion or political or gender or anything else. It's just open. If you want to join a co-op, you can. But this education, amplifying the message, I got that. That's why we have this radio show, and that's why NCB sponsors it, to amplify the message about co-ops. How do you see, or do you see a way that these credit unions can help to amplify the message more? We got the largest number of cooperators in the world, I believe, in the U.S. are in credit unions. There's 150 million people.
Yeah. I think that, increasingly you see some of the largest ones advertising. I would really love to see literally the word, it's a cooperative. Front and center on that. It's great to advertise all the cheaper rates and so forth and how we're friendly and we're not banks. I think that's great. But I really want to see the words cooperative just messaged much more broadly. We got a lot more work to do in that.
And why cooperatives are better. What's the benefits of cooperation? Yes. Yeah. Last message, what do you want to leave people with?
Well, we're all suffering in this pandemic. We're not all suffering equally, as you know, that certain communities, and certainly communities of color, bear a disproportionate burden in suffering, from this. We will in the end get through it. We will in the end get through it. And I think that there will be a kind of surge of energy to rebuild and build new in the months and the years to come. And credit unions are well positioned and to take advantage of it. And they should define themselves in those terms. We got a long history, but we can have a long future as well.
So everybody out there, Cliff is also saying, figure out where your credit union is, join a credit union. You have more say. You can help save money. You can help our communities strive and succeed. Cliff, thank you for taking out the time to being with us today. I really appreciate your message, your book, everything that you've done in your life. And everybody else out there, we'll see you next Thursday. Next month is Black History Month, and we'll have a program for you for there. Please live cooperatively.
Thank you, Vernon.